Just go verify now it's on live because I know YouTube lags behind a bit. So, just to check it, I don't know what. Looks like I am live. So, good evening or good afternoon or good morning, wherever or whenever you listen to this. This is William T. Sherman, The Scourge of the South, Part 1. Now, I did run a poll on my channel earlier this week wherein I asked which title was preferred between the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse in one versus the Scourge of the South, and the latter one. I can see why. Very simplistic, very much concise and to the point. So yeah, that's what we're going with. The reasoning behind the former name was with Sherman, his reputation was such that he was looked upon as like an apocalyptic force, especially in Georgia when he marched through there. Now, the thing about William T. Sherman was, contrary to what the reputation about him suggests, he actually did not glorify in what he did during the war. So that's why I don't think I'm going to be playing any music on either of these two streams about William T. Sherman, because there's that famous song "Marching Through Georgia," which everyone knows, but the thing was Sherman hated that song, absolutely hated. And I think because whenever you see a video dedicated to William T. Sherman, or indeed in particular about the March to the Sea within Georgia, Sherman himself despised how much people would just glorify that portion of the war. So I hope that by the end of I hope by this time next week, after people watch these two streams, people will understand the sort of nuances around Sherman, which was to say that he was a man of war and he waged total war because that was just the reality of the war. I mean, like Stonewall Jackson, who I've covered, was thinking the exact same thing in regards to the South, which regards to the South against the North, where at the start of the war, he was saying this is going to be a total war, many millions will suffer, and the main way to win the war would be to scorch the earth upon the enemy soil. Now, it just so happened that Jefferson Davis never listened to that and he shut it down, whereas in the end, you did have William T. Sherman doing his March to the Sea and the devastation that wrought that won the war for the Union, among other factors, but that's one of the most high-profile reasons why the Union won. See, the thing about William T. Sherman, he was known as, he was called crazy in his lifetime. Now, he's similar to Cromwell in that they both suffered manic depression. So that's one thing. Another thing that you'll see a lot. And there's that famous quote from Sherman where it goes, "Grant stuck by me when I was crazy, and I stuck by him when he was drunk." Now, that's a bit of an oversimplification because, as I'll detail in my Ulysses S. Grant streams, Grant wasn't a drunkard in context of the Civil War. He actually had a guy by the name of Rawlins on his staff to prevent him from drinking, because Rawlins was known for being quite insubordinate and known for sort of largely tapping Grant on the shoulder, at least just to warn him off ever drinking during the Civil War. And indeed, that sobriety is maintained throughout the Civil War. It was only through monotony of garrison duty in Western territories that, for example, Grant had drank. I mean, in the case of William T. Sherman, he was known for being crazy, supposedly, although we in history know he's been vindicated by his predictions of a long, brutal civil war. So, yeah, and his modus operandi of waging war, I mean, I'll state here from the outset, for avoidance of doubt, that I don't think Sherman did anything wrong. I mean, certainly John Bell Hood and Joseph E. Johnston, who fought against him in Georgia, they said, look, Sherman didn't do anything wrong. Like, if we were in his position, we'd do exactly the same things to the North in his position. So, yeah. And I'm just looking at it as from an outsider point of view. I'm trying to think objectively as possible. I do not believe Sherman did anything wrong. Now, yeah, there were some things that I put onto him, but actually he didn't do, like Atlanta burning, which actually was more John Bell Hood. Like he was doing the scorched earth policy, similar to how the Russians burned down Moscow to spite Napoleon and deny him supplies during the Russian campaign. Nothing wrong with it. It's just that's just war, and Sherman just happened to be one of the better actors of it in the American Civil War. So yeah, without that with that sort of what I might say the preface or the uh, preface towards the wider topic at large. That's my thought process regarding William T. Sherman. Now, William T. Sherman, he was a guy who stirred a lot of controversy, and he had quite a storied life, especially in the Civil War, which is why I've been reading his memoirs. Now, the thing about William T. Sherman was that before the Civil War, like for example, he served in the army, he went to West Point, he served in the Mexican War. Although it's before the Civil War, he does not command troops in active combat. For example, in the Mexican War, he is largely doing admin duties out in California. For example, he goes around between what was called Yerba Buena, which is basically San Francisco today, Monterey, which is where he landed, and then you have Los Angeles, which at that time was a small town. It's only really under America that California expands to what it is today, how well built it is, and how big the main cities there are. So, yeah, that's one thing. Yeah, William T. Sherman. So his family has been in America going back to 1636, if his memoirs are to be correct on that one. I mean, I got no reason to disbelieve that. So the Sherman family originally came from Essex in England. I don't know which part of Essex precisely. I think it's Chelmsford, but I could be wrong. So they originally came from Essex. They moved over to America in 1636, and the Sherman family originally they set up shop in the Massachusetts, Connecticut area. Although as time passes, by the time you get into the mid 19th century, the Sherman family, you got one branch that has moved over to Ohio, and that's where the Sherman family, like William T. Sherman's father, had moved to. Because I believe, Sherman would be a second generation Ohioan. His father, of course, being a first generation sort of mover into Ohio, because his grandfather was, I forget, he was something like a circuit judge or something like that in Western Connecticut, and then the family moved ever westward into Ohio itself. So yeah, that's how the Sherman family ended up in Ohio by the time that Sherman was born in 1820. And with Sherman, I mean, there's not much to say about his early life in the grand scheme of things. He grew up in a family that was doing fairly well. Like you're talking middle class kind of background. You got judges. For example, his brother John, who later becomes he later gets elected to the House of Representatives and later on to the Senate. Yeah, that brother John, he becomes a politician later in life. And Sherman kind of has some awkward questions to be asked of him when he's down in Louisiana teaching military engineering to students at a Louisiana educational institution, similar to like a Louisiana version of VMI that I mentioned for Stonewall Jackson. VMI, of course, being Virginia Military Institute. This particular Louisiana institution he's taught at, where he was a superintendent. Yeah, that's where Sherman teaches military engineering. Now, before he went over to Louisiana, as mentioned, he goes to West Point. He does fairly well. He passes. He gets into the Mexican War. He serves in a regiment. As if there's not much to be said about the Mexican War from Sherman's point of view. He doesn't see any active battlefield service. Indeed, it's not until the First Battle of Bull Run in 1861 that Sherman actually sees a full-fledged battle in his own eyes. So, yeah, as in California, he's doing largely admin duties, like dealing with local administration, the people. He'll spend some time, for example, socializing with the local inhabitants, because I know, like, when Mexicans today say that California was always theirs, it's kind of a bit iffy, because yes, in a sense, like, there's always been Mexicans living there, but on the other hand, it's, well, Mexico didn't really display much actual administrative capabilities in California. The Comanche probably had more sway in that part of what used to be Mexico, north of Rio Grande, before the Mexican War of 1846 to 48. So yeah, Sherman serves there. Now the thing was, in order for Sherman to get there, because it's worth noting, to get from, let's say a territory like Kansas over to California is practically impossible, because it's wild Native American territory. So Sherman and the regiment he was with, they go over by ship via Brazil. So they land at the dock at Rio de Janeiro for a short while, where they got to meet Emperor Pedro II, as well as his Sicilian wife of the House of Bourbon, Parma, and yeah, they mainly just taken. They mainly, and Sherman does, in his memoirs, he does like very much describe the Coracaldo, and he still describes how, for example, say rainwater collects on the tall roofs of like houses in Rio de Janeiro, and it's worth noting as well. Yeah, Rio de Janeiro at this time was Rio de Janeiro we think of today with the favelas. Like Rio de Janeiro, like Brazil at this time was under Emperor Pedro II. Brazil does prosper quite well under his stewardship. Like, it's very much after Pedro II is couped out that Brazil falls into the position we know Brazil today, in terms of poverty and how badly remote down the places. But certainly under Pedro II, it was very much a blossoming state. And yeah, I could do a stream about Empire of Brazil one day. I don't know how much interest that would garner, but that's certainly one thing I'd like to study. And also study the War of the Triple Alliance between Brazil, Argentina, and Uruguay against Paraguay, in one of the most lopsided wars and most disastrous wars I think one can read about in military history. A very interesting conflict, because 90% of Paraguay gets killed. 90% of Paraguay's male population get killed in a war we would today regard as stupid. So yeah, you have Sherman with his regiment. They they go over through Brazil. They go through the Cape Horn, which, of course, the Panama Canal wasn't a thing at this point, although it was often an MO of travel that when Sherman goes back to the eastern seaboard, for example, he goes over to Florida and then goes up for Georgia and goes back to Ohio. At a later point in the 1850s, he goes through a ship that docks in Panama and then goes on to another ship that docks in the Caribbean coastline of Panama up until New Orleans, I believe. Yeah, he lands into the deep south, and yeah, that's how travel kind of worked back then. And also, Ulysses S. Grant traveled a similar way after the Mexican War, but that was fought of malaria, and it really was just a matter of travel just being really awkward, because you don't have a transcontinental railroads as you do later on in the 19th century, and you don't have a Panama Canal, and steamships are a very new thing for the Americans. So it's really just very much a matter of communications between West and East parts of North America being very haphazard and being very awkward, to say the least. So yeah, Sherman, he serves in the Mexican War. He spends the years of the war in California. He does actually help to open up a bank in California, I believe in the area of San Francisco, if I'm not mistaken, which was renamed that way during the Mexican War, because they were it was known as Yerba Buena, and then was one officer who wanted to change his name to Benicia, but that one officer was overruled by everyone else, who just said, let's name it after St. Francis of Assisi. So that's how it became San Francisco. And the thing about the thing about California in the Mexican War was it was not long after the war, perhaps even during the war, if memory serves me right, that gold was discovered in California. So you just have this position where a lot a lot of the volunteers, again, like this is another haphazard thing about the U.S. Army, was the U.S. Army was always quite small in these days, like around like 26,000 odd. I'm rounding down or up a bit generously. Nevertheless, that's how small the army was. So when you get to the Mexican War, there's a half a U.S. Army. Uh, well, the U.S. Army goes up in numbers, and half of those numbers that join like are volunteers, the other half being regulars. And to preserve discipline, you're having to have situations where half of a garrison or half of an army are volunteers and the other half are regulars to keep them in line. You know, Ulysses S. Grant, for example, was known for being very good at keeping discipline with volunteers, which is why he gets noticed later on, and he that helps him to get onto command later on. Whereas in the case of William T. Sherman, he had to deal with like admin issues relating to volunteers just absconding. Like they'll just go over and just dig for gold and not bother with their military duties, which was always a present thorn. So yeah, that's the thing about the Mexican War was for someone like Sherman, it was largely quiet. It was more of an enjoyment trip in context of him just administrating California after the whole state was taken by mid-January 1847. Because the thing about the Mexican War as well was the real fighting was more encountered by Zachary Taylor coming through Texas, and then you've got Winfield Scott through Veracruz. So Sherman, as it's stated, he doesn't see much action. Yeah, and after the war, he does help to set up a bank in San Francisco. It lasts barely a few years because you have a panic in 1853, and that business goes under. So Sherman goes away from San Francisco, and he ends up just going back towards Ohio, and I believe, and it's around this time he helped to open up a law firm. And the thing about this law firm was, weirdly, look, in the case of Sherman, he was not a guy who passed the bar at all. Like he wasn't a guy who actually had experience teaching law, or indeed like studying it to begin with. And despite that disadvantage, like the business lasted a short while, but yeah, this leads him into 1859, where he's seeking opportunity to teach something like military engineering, and this is where he becomes a superintendent for a Louisiana military institute, similar to VMI in Virginia, where he's teaching students, and he's also a superintendent. Now, a funny coincidence was that Braxton Bragg happened to be working there as well, and Braxton Bragg actually said to him at the time, "Look, if I knew you could have applied for this." This was before the Civil War, so not even mentioning like the Braxton Bragg fighting against Sherman in later battles, like Chattanooga campaign, for example. Braxton Bragg just said to Sherman outright, like, if I knew you were a possible candidate for this job, I would have struck you off the list. And yeah, Sherman, he has some good relationships with some of the faculty, including principal, a guy called Moore, who was a slave plantation owner. And there was this like sort of dinner meeting where Moore actually asked, and this was like 1861, amidst the time of secession, and you have Louisiana in January, where they are actively seceding after like a state convention about the topic, where Moore actually asks Sherman, "What do you think about slavery?" Because it's worth noting that, as mentioned, Sherman had a brother by the name of John, who endorsed a book called The Impending Crisis of the South. Now, this book, The Impending Crisis of the South, was one where it was an abolitionist book. However, it wasn't abolitionist on the basis of racial egalitarianism or anything like that. It was abolitionist on the basis that slavery was bad for white man. So, if that book was released today, it would be derided as white supremacist and all names under the sun. Like it's as mentioned in previous streams, like the abolitionism you get in America around this time, it's a lot more skewy. Like it's certainly not based on racial egalitarianism. It's very much of a we find slavery disgusting and we don't want it because we are good Christians, or you get other people who say we don't want slavery because it results in millions of black people living in North America where we don't want them here and we just want to ship them back to Africa, including a certain Abraham Lincoln, who, of course, was, as mentioned, he was a member of the American Colonization Society, whose his intentions were to free the slaves, all 4 million of them, and ship them all off to somewhere like Liberia or other areas like Haiti and the Dominican Republic and Cuba and Central America and so on, because there was always that prescient idea of this time that whites and blacks cannot live side by side equally in society. It was a very minority view amongst guys like Thaddeus Stevens and the radical Republicans to ever believe in such an idea. So yeah, you have, for example, William T. Sherman, who he has a very conservative view about the question of slavery. It's very much of a, because he was quoted in, and he says it in himself in his memoirs, where he says he does not wish to abolish it, and indeed most Union generals weren't. Like Grant, for example, Grant only fought against the Confederacy early onset because they were rebelling against the Union. Whereas, and Sherman was of that similar opinion, where he did not want secession, and he was actually weeping when, for example, he heard of the news that Louisiana has seceded. It's very much of a situation where he was very much conservatively minded. Like he actually quite liked the South, and he quite respected the South and agrarian institutions. He was not this bloodthirsty tyrant that you get people thinking later on, where people think Sherman hated the South. No, he didn't. His time in Louisiana kind of proved that, and he gets on well with a lot of these plantation owners and these. And it's also another thing in his memoirs where he actually mentions like the different classes within the South. For example, he mentions the Southern planters. He mentions the small-time farmers and the middle and like sort of small-time mercantile types. And he also mentions what he calls the young bloods, so guys like Nathan Bedford Forrest and Stonewall Jackson and Patrick R. Claiborne and other figures of that sort who, are Southerners or people who are on the Southern side, who very much are the kind of guy where Sherman would say, they have to be either killed or employed for us to have peace after the Civil War. And yeah, that kind of tells you something about William T. Sherman, was that he very much looked upon the South as a respectable adversary. He did not hate him. And this is one thing I'm going to keep reiterating throughout the stream, or streams, I should say, through part 1 and part 2, was Sherman was not a guy who hated the South. So yeah, you have Sherman who, at this time, you have, for example, you have Sherman who, at this time, there is an accusation that dogs him after the war, where people accuse him of breaking Southern hospitality, which was not at all the case. He resigned from the Louisiana military institute where he was teaching, and he made sure to collect all the wages and all of the monies that he was owed. And in turn, this is where he makes his journey up north. Now, he bore no ill will towards anyone on the southern part I say bore no one any ill will. I mean, there's a famous speech which I'll quote, and you can find it on Wikipedia. Never mind, in his personal memoirs, detailing what Sherman's own personal views about secession, where he said, and I'll quote, "You people of the South do not know what you are doing. This country will be drenched in blood, and God only knows how it will end. It is all folly, madness, a crime against civilization. You people speak so lightly of war. You don't know what you're talking about. War is a terrible thing. You mistake to the people of the North. They are a peaceable people, but an earnest people too, and they will fight. They are not going to let this country be destroyed without a mighty effort to save it. Besides, where are your men and appliances of war to contend against them? The North can make a steam engine, locomotive, or railway car. Hardly a yard of cloth or a pair of shoes can you make. You are rushing into war with one of the most powerful, ingeniously mechanical, and determined peoples on earth, right on your doorstep. You are bound to fail. Only in your spirit and determination are you prepared for war. In all else, you are totally unprepared, with a bad cause to start with. At first, you will make headway, but as your limited resources begin to fail, shut out from the markets of Europe as you will be, your course will begin to wane. If your people will stop and think, they must see in the end you will surely fail. Yeah, and it's very much of a time where when he was quoted as saying that by a friend of his by the name of David French Boyd, a Virginian secessionist, it was very much a situation where everyone looked at him as mad. But of course, we know in hindsight he was completely vindicated. Like, he even said, for example, at first you'll make headway because it's worth noting the Southerners had, on average, this average Southern guy had more training with firearms compared to the more urbanized uh, lads you get up north from places like Ohio and New York and Pennsylvania and so on. Whereas you get the South, especially in like a state like, it's worth noting, you have, for example, the state of Texas, for example. Well, Texas was built and pretty much founded as we know it by guys from Tennessee, and the men and women of Tennessee themselves originally came from South Carolina. And you're talking guys like the Forrest family, Nathan Bedford Forrest and his family, or Andrew Jackson before him. And the South Carolinians, a lot of them were Ulster Scots. So it's fair to say the South it's fair to say the South from Virginia down to Texas is all like one big family in a sense, especially in the case of like sort of Texas, Tennessee, and South Carolina, which is why, for example, states like Louisiana and Florida and Texas and Tennessee and so on, they all secede when war is declared, even when some of them might not specifically agree about defending slavery with bayonets. But yeah, it's a very nuanced, complicated time for. I can imagine, even to this day, like Americans can think of it as a very nuanced, multifaceted conflict in terms of motivations. Because it's like, for example, you can say, in the case of the South, like states like South Carolina, Mississippi, and Georgia, that explicitly mention slavery in their declarations of secession. But it's not the only reason, because there were valid grievances on the part of the South. Because, for example, after the war, as stated, you have the North. They'll say, well, we are fighting to free the slaves, and we're fighting to ensure blacks equal rights. A lot of them will say this, but northern states such as Illinois and Ohio, for example, they refused black suffrage. So I can imagine, like, if you're a southerner of that time, you'll probably think of the northerners as hypocrites. Now, that's not to say the southerners weren't also hypocritical, because, like they'll say state rights, but then the Confederate Constitution forbade any state from pledging to get rid of slavery, even if it was on their own prerogative. So it's a matter of both sides were in the wrong. And it was very much of for someone like William T. Sherman, who knew people on the southern side, but also was a northerner from Ohio who fought for the Union. You can understand someone like Sherman was bitterly torn in the middle. But in the end, he's going to go with defending the Constitution. Not just that, but it's also the fact that he's from Ohio. He's not going to raise arms against guys from Ohio in the same way that Robert E. Lee could never bring himself to fight against his own Virginian brethren. And there's honor to that. So with the advent of the Civil War, you do get Sherman. He commands a brigade of the First Battle of Bull Run, as shown here. For example, you see Sherman here. He commands troops where they move at the Farm Ford, and you get Stone Bridge here. I mean, and the thing was, you have Confederate troops that were raking along against Schenck, at Stonebridge. So yeah, you have Sherman who crosses along Farm Ford, and he fights near Pittsylvania and here against blocks of Bartow. And yeah, it was really a matter of he helped, and Sherman does his own part to help Irvin McDowell's overall plan of the right flank smashing down on the Confederate left. And yeah, his advance went up to Henry House Hill. Now, the thing about First Battle Bull Run, for someone of Sherman's point of view, Sherman, to my mind, he's not especially remembered for anything. He does command a brigade, as mentioned, along the Warrington Turnpike, and he does command troops crossing Farm Ford, fighting against Bartow and B around Matthews Hill. But yeah, of course, as mentioned in the Stonewall Jackson stream, you do get the Confederates later on under Jackson here, but go on to Henry House Hill and may chuck back the Union forces led by the likes of Porter, Burnside, Schenck, and so on. Yeah, and yeah, it was really a matter of, as Shelby Foote himself would say in his evaluation of a battle, like you can find it on the Ken Burns documentary in the 80s, where he says basically it was like it was kind of like a ramshackle skirmish rather than a full-blown battle as we think of. You think of, for example, it's like the later Battle of Shiloh, which I'll mention, which I'll get round to, was also just like at one point it just became like a sort of mess of like 100 skirmishes just all happening coincidentally, because it's fair to say both sides had really unwieldy armies, and the Union Army and the Confederates, they both found out to their detriment like how difficult it is when you've got many guys having a baptism of fire in these battles, and it really just becomes a matter of, in this early phase of a war. I mean, there's that famous quote attributed to Helmut von Moltke, the elder, who says, "Oh, the American Civil War was just two mobs battering at one another with sticks." And when you look at a battle like First Bull Run, you can see why that quote gets it's a false quote, because the quote implies a sense of complacency on the part of the Prussians, which that's certainly one thing you can't say about the Prussians at that time, was they were never complacent at all. Helmut von Moltke was very much eager to learn what he could from the American Civil War. So, but yeah, that quote does kind of describe how bad it was for both sides at the start of the war. Oh, buddy, I just want that water wrong. I'm sorry about that. So yeah, Sherman. Nothing really special happens for Sherman or indeed the Union Army, where Stonewall Jackson defends quite aptly, and by the end of the day, the Union forces are driven to rout. Now, the Confederates, yeah, it's a hollow victory at best because they don't really pursue it. It's really much more of a tactical victory, and even then, it was literally because of Stonewall Jackson and Joseph E. Johnston more than anything. I mean, you do have Peachey C. Beauregard rallying the troops, but yeah, so there's not much more to be said. Yeah, than that. And of course, yeah, I said, like, you have Sherman here who rebounds here to face off against Jeb Stuart along the Manassas-Studley Road, and then you got the 7th and 49th Virginia regiments going against him, because to his left he's got Ricketts, and to the rear you got Howard along Chin Ridge. Yeah. So yeah, after First Battle of Bull Run, Sherman, at first he's offered the job of Assistant Secretary of War to serve under Edwin Stanton. He refuses this because in the latter end of 1861, getting into 1862, like, he's dispatched towards Missouri way to help train up some troops around it, because it's worth noting that as in the Mexican War, Sherman was a quartermaster in context of that war, and likewise here, he's sent to help train troops, help get troops get ready into 1862, because the war was largely quiet. I mean, you do have Confederate troops getting into Kentucky. For example, you got Polk here who goes towards Columbus, and you've got this kind of area of Kentucky, and also Crittenden around here towards Mill Springs. But yeah, the latter half of 1861 rather quiet, all things considered. So yeah, you have you do have Sherman. He helps to train troops. It's not until February 1862, sorry, that he gets promoted to Major General. Now, it's worth noting that he's promoted to Major General of Volunteers. He does get the rank Major General of Regulars in 1864 in time for the March to the Sea. Now, one might ask what's the difference between a regular rank versus a volunteer rank. Well, so in the American Civil War, the army had to go from 26,000 up to somewhere upwards of 2 million by the end of it. This resulted in many guys being promoted that in peacetime they won't have those same jobs, or they might just be demobilized altogether. So, for example, the most high-profile case I can think of is George Armstrong Custer, who in the war he was a general. However, after the war, he goes back to his regular rank of lieutenant colonel. If I remember correctly, lieutenant colonel, I believe the rank was. And yeah, for someone and in the case of Sherman, he gets promoted to Major General of Volunteers. So let's say, for argument's sake, let's say the war ended not long after he got promoted there. That volunteer rank would not follow him after the war. He would go back to the regular rank he had before the war. So that's kind of how the American Army works. You have a regular rank and a volunteer rank. So yeah, it's really into 1864 he gets promoted to Major General in time for the March to the Sea and the Georgia campaign and so on. Now, he commands a division under Grant in time. Not long after you get the sieges of Fort Henry and Fort Donelson here in Northwestern, because you have the Tennessee and Cumberland rivers, which, as you can see, you got Fort Donelson here. When this falls, this river here, the Cumberland River, is really wide open into Nashville. And you see the Cumberland River goes all the way up to nearby the Cumberland Gap here, which feeds into Virginia. So you understand. So this is a thing about the Western Theatre altogether, is that it's very much of a war of fighting over railway junctions and riverways. The Mississippi River especially is the most important vector of such a waterway campaign. And this is why, later on, for example, you have a Vicksburg campaign, which many people, including myself, would argue was really the decisive point of a civil war, where it carved up the Confederacy in half. So yeah, you have Sherman, who serves under Grant into 1862. Yeah, latter end of February. Yeah, you have. Meanwhile, you have. This is Buell's Army of Ohio. Grant's army, I believe, was called the Army of the Tennessee. If I'm not, because it's worth noting that, as mentioned in previous streams, the Confederates named their armies after geographical places. So, for example, the Confederates might call their Army of Tennessee, whereas a Union army of that equivalent would be called Army of the Tennessee, after the river. So yeah, you have Grant. He goes down the Tennessee River, and he ends up at Vicksburg Landing nearby Charlotte. And yeah, this is where Grant and Sherman both get criticism for this battle. But the criticism towards Sherman is a bit unfair because I mean he was a division commander. He was acting on orders for the criticism, which I'm about to relay. So you have Sherman, for example, along the right flank of Grant at Charlotte, because you have Pittsburgh Landing here. You have Grant; he has his headquarters nearby here, and Sherman here is on the right flank. Now, he was the most forward-facing division within the Army of Tennessee under Grant at this time. Now, people blamed Sherman for getting surprise attacks, going, "Oh well, you should have fortified your position." To which, well, Ulysses S. Grant was a guy who ordered no fortification work to be done, mainly because he thought it would demoralize the men, but also because he genuinely never expected Albertine and Johnston to attack at this time. He didn't. He knew there were Confederate troops in the area, but he thought no better than raiding, and he did not anticipate this particular attack in the full force it was. And in the case of Sherman, for example, he's alongside his orderly when his orderly actually gets shot in front of him or by the side of him, and Sherman he gets shot through the hand by one of Patrick Cleburne's skirmishers in the early morning of April 6th. So yeah, Sherman he finds it really the hard way that this is not just a small skirmish or anything particularly small. This is a full-fledged battle, and yeah, you have Sherman and McClellan and WHL. You got Hurlbut here on the left. Hurlbut, by the way, he's got a brigade under Stuart. Stuart, by the way, was one of Sherman's subordinates in the war at this time, and so Stuart. This is one thing where that kind of tells you how unprepared the Union Army was. That even like, for example, Sherman's command was like split in two. You'd have like a brigade of Sherman's command over here, while the rest of Sherman's command was here on the right flank. Now, to be fair, it wasn't actually choke pointed. You got two creeks. Here you got Lick Creek here, and you got Snake Creek here, and it's kind of like one of those battlefields where it's kind of like it might seem long, but it's also quite constricted as well. Good evening. Good evening, man of viewers. Yeah, I don't. Yeah, I'm planning on doing a stream. I might plan to do a stream at a later point of Empire Brazil because not many people know of it, and everyone knows of Brazil we get nowadays, and Brazil wasn't always like that. It was, and yeah, it's a very underrated kind of historical era, in my humble opinion. So yeah, thanks for the heads up. So yeah, you have Shiloh now. I'll see. I'll get my book. So to quote Shelby Foote's book about his novel Shiloh. So at Shiloh. So he's quoted by a guy called Farrington, who was a Union soldier at this particular battle. He said, he said of Sherman that he was red-headed, gaunt, skeleton thin, with a wild expression around his eyes. He had sunken temples, a fuzzy beard, and a hungry look that seemed to follow him always. I never saw him, but I thought of Lazarus. His shoulders twitched, his hands were never still, always fumbling with something, a button or a saber hilt to his whiskers. Our first real operation, however, changed our minds about him. Well, truth to tell, it was not a successful movement. Yeah, I'm actually thinking about Sherman, like, that's one thing. Like, I'm actually thinking about Sherman, like, yeah, as I said, this was his first active combat command, and it was a matter of while his movements in this battle, for example, were not successful because they were surprise attacked, and Sherman gets some stick for this in hindsight, but it's kind of, I just say, look, blame goes to Grant for the lack of preparedness on the part of the Union Army here. Yeah, and you just have this position with Shiloh. If you look up what Shelby Foote has to say about battle, he will say, for example, all the trees all over the battlefield, because you see it's densely wooded, as you can see. To visualize it, imagine fighting a pitched battle, like Napoleonic style pitched battle in the middle of Mirkwood in the Hobbit. That's kind of what Shiloh was like. It was thickly leafed, and you could barely see anything. It was a very dark kind of battlefield where the vegetation obscured sunlight. Like you could go from these two creeks without coming across sunlight. Some people would say. I think Shelby Foote would also say something of that sort in his work about Battle of Shiloh, was that you could go from one end of a battlefield without ever touching sunlight, because that was just how dark and obscure the battlefield underneath all the trees, which were thickly leafed, owing to it being April. It was spring. So yeah, it's a very ugly battle. It was very much like 100 small skirmishes all taking place at once, rather than like a organized battle in the way you would conceive it. And you do have, for example, I'm trying to think, where is it? Prentice. I believe it's around. Yeah, I'm trying to think. Yeah, it'd be like. Yeah, I'm trying to think. Be like around here. You have a hornet's nest. It's aptly named because it really was just a genuine hornet's nest where Nathaniel Prentice he holds out for such a long time despite the odds against Braxton Bragg that yeah he ends up having to surrender. However, it's a matter of on the part of Prentice. He's kind of got a bit of a I told you so moment because he did predict for the Confederates that they were going to lose the battle. And he did that was, I mean, as mentioned in the Nathan Bedford Forest Part 1 stream, the Confederates, in a way, like, it was a chance in hell that they were going to win to begin with because Grant's army against Albert Sidney Johnston's force, later led by P.G.T. Beauregard after Johnston dies at 2:30 p.m. on April 6th. It was really a chance in hell if the Confederates were going to win. It was probably the best chance they ever had, to be honest. So I don't think the Confederates did anything wrong. It was just too much was against them. And especially when you get Buell reinforcing through crossing on like Tennessee with be around here on this map, crossing Pittsburgh Landing onto the 9th of 6th into the 7th of April. So by the time it's dawn on April 7th, yeah, Buell attacks alongside a guy called Lew Wallace. Now Wallace, he does attack because his forces did not reach the battlefield despite frantic calls from Grant. Because it's worth noting, Wallace was a divisional commander under Grant. So yeah, Wallace he screws up by not getting to the battle in time, but nevertheless he does get in time anyway for the second day, and he is very much a vanguard for that assault. So yeah, the Confederates by this time are exhausted. It's worth noting another thing as well. It doesn't really show on this map, but another advantage the Union troops had was that they were on a high elevation along the hills because this was like all wooded hills. Really terrible terrain to wage a battle in for the Confederate side. So yeah, it's really just suboptimal kind of battlefield to kind of fight if you're the Confederates anyway. And when you get to the second day, I mean, there's actually like a famous conversation that Sherman has with Grant about this on the night of April 6th, where he said, where Sherman said to Grant, "We've had the devil's on luck today, haven't we?" And Grant just says, "Yes, lick 'em tomorrow, though." And yeah, that sort of small conversation kind of tells you the measure of what confidence the Union commanders had at that point, because they knew full well that the Confederates were exhausted. They didn't know at this time that Albert Sidney Johnston was dead, but they certainly knew that the Confederates were tired. They must be tired because they had to do almost like a forced march through rain the previous nights leading up to the battle, which will help to slow them down. And Albert Sidney Johnston, he actually got furious with Braxton Bragg at one point because Bragg, one of his divisions actually got lost on the way, and it cost the Confederates precious time. Because let's say, for argument's sake, hypothetically, the Confederates get to Shiloh, let's say April 4th or 5th, Grant loses. And it's worth noting, Grant was actually a lot of intrigue against some like McClernand, for example. I'll talk about it more when I do Ulysses S. Grant in a couple of weeks' time. But yeah, the thing about McClernand was, while he was competent, he was very insubordinate and very much a political scheming, ladder climbing backstabber of a guy. He was a war Democrat. He had to be put in that spot because he was a war Democrat, and Lincoln needed Democrats to help wage the war. So it was kind of how things had to be most times for the Union side. So yeah, and McClernand was also a dogged opponent of Sherman's because Sherman was quite loyal to Grant, especially later on in the Civil War, especially by the time of the Vicksburg campaign where McClernand gets sacked off. So Shiloh happens. April 7th, we get turned back. Yeah. And that's where, you get, for example, you can see the increments here at 5 a.m. they start turning back, 11 a.m. they're back here. And then you get into the afternoon, and then it's getting dark. like by night time. Yeah. Now, I went miss here. Like, you get a place called Fallen Timbers, which where I mentioned in my Nathan Bedford Forest Part One stream, where Nathan Bedford Forest he helps to cover the retreat by charging into Sherman's lines because Sherman sent some skirmishers to help with pursuit. Sherman was the main guy, of course, tasked with the pursuit, and yeah, and that's sort of Sherman's first brushing with one of his most dogged opponents in the Civil War, and certainly the guy he would later call the Devil. So yeah, after this, after the Battle of Shiloh, you just have this position where he goes down the Mississippi River towards Memphis, which they take, and you also have Fort Pillow, which is abandoned on July 12th, 1862. For a short while shortly after Shiloh, there's a bit of rest and recover, but yeah, Sherman gets dispatched down here. Like, for example, your Island Number 10, which was taken by John Pope in help with the help of the Navy, flotilla in the area. So yeah, Memphis, which as you can see, is a very important railway junction. But also an important spot anyway along the Mississippi, which is a very important vector of attack. So yeah. Meanwhile, you do have, for example, Braxton Bragg. He does his Kentucky Heartland campaign, which doesn't end well for him. And yeah, you get other guys like Rosecrans, and yeah, Rosecrans, for example, he relieves Buell in charge of the Army of Ohio. Yeah, and you have Earl Van Dorn. Now, it's worth noting, yeah, when you get into October time, you have battles around Corinth. At first, the Union take over under Grant and Sherman, not long after Shiloh. Earl Van Dorn later retakes it, or rather, like he tries to retake it. Sorry, in October time, but he gets warded off by Rosecrans in October time. Yeah, and Corinth, you see here, there's like a railway because you got the East Tennessee Georgia Railroad. So you have, for example, it goes through Knoxville, through Chattanooga, which will be mentioned later. It goes through Huntsville, Decatur, Corinth, into Memphis, and then down south. I'm have to think about, yeah, as mentioned previously, yeah, railway lines are very much important in terms of like, and on one hand, you can say like it becomes very predictable for vector of attack. It's similar to how, for example, like the current war in Ukraine, where the Russians often attack along communication lines and high ground and stuff like that. It's still very predictable, but also it's a matter of just basic military logic. So yeah, you have Sherman who he serves under Grant, and yeah, and you get into the latter half of 1862 where he's taken along Memphis. You have also Arkansas Post in the context of Vicksburg. Yeah, so you have. Yeah, so you have, for example, Grant. He goes here. Meanwhile, Sherman he gets dispatched more towards down the riverway. Now, with Grant, he's leading pretty much like a military department of the Mississippi, and he can dispatch like sort of almost like an entire army corps over to Sherman. And the thing about Sherman was he was the only guy that Grant really trusted to deal with the Vicksburg campaign in terms of his role, in terms of dealing, like because you have, for example, Vicksburg down here, and for example, you have like Mississippi Delta, very swampy country, like very awkward. Like as Sherman and Grant will find it the hard way, you can't approach Vicksburg from north and they find it the hard way. So yeah, you have Holly Springs up here in northern Ohio. I mean, northern Mississippi. So what to say, Ohio, northern Mississippi. Grant here. Meanwhile, yeah, you got Sherman who goes down it, and you also got McClernand as well. Sherman and McClernand sharing command almost. Yeah, and they do get into Arkansas Post. Now, Grant at first said, "No, this is a distraction. You need to deal with Vicksburg." However, Grant grows to appreciate what Sherman was planning because he was planning actually going like west of the Mississippi Delta, like going through this way, like Lake Providence. And you see here, Sherman goes through here. He tries to attack through Steele's Bayou, but as mentioned, it's just really awkward terrain. Like, I mean, even to this day, the Vicksburg area is just really awkward terrain to try and wage a campaign in, very awful ground, very boggy. And in the case of Sherman, it's not just that he's not working with supply lines anymore, he's also working with no communication. So there are times where, for example, when Grant has to pull back because you got Earl Van Dorn dealing like tearing up. You got, for example, in Tennessee, you got Nathan Bedford Forrest raiding his supply lines. You also got Earl Van Dorn tearing up supply lines in northern Mississippi. Earl Van Dorn, by the way, was actually a guy born in Mississippi, so he knows his country like the back of his hand. So yeah, you have those two guys on the Confederate side who are just really massive pain in the arse, and they do drive a sense of anxiety into Grant and Sherman. Yeah, no other way to put it than that. It's just the fact that he was just a very nightmarish. Well, nightmarish is probably overselling it, but certainly it's just a very frustrating scenario if you're Grant and Sherman. Although one thing that Sherman does credit Grant on, and this is certainly one thing we can credit both Sherman and Grant for, is they are both very dogged individuals. They will just carry on with a military objective, regardless of how difficult they find it. So, in the case of a Vicksburg campaign, yeah, it's very much of a they planned to approach from the north at first, doesn't work out well, and we have to pull back. Then later on, yeah, I mean, you have, for example, try and dig canals around here. So, for example, you got around here, like west of Vicksburg, they tried to dig canals to help with game food, help the Navy, for example, because the Navy will be very important for this. But the canals, they don't really serve much use. And to be fair, another thing is Grant, he made sure to never repeat the same mistake he made at Shiloh. So he also fortified his positions to keep the men busy, if nothing else, because one thing you do know is if, in the case of in the case of men who are bored, they'll create distractions of their own. So yeah, it's kind of Grant does the best of all worlds with what he can. Now, yeah, you have Sherman now. Grant and Sherman, they have their forces parked all the way from Lake Providence, all the way up to here. Oh, sorry, was it? Where is it? Oh, Young's Point. That was it. Sorry, Young's Point up to Lake Providence area. Sorry, that's where. Yeah, and as a for example, Sherman ends up doing a feint around Haynes Bluff and Snyder's Bluff in this area here by the Yazoo River to make Pemberton think that Sherman, for example, is going to attack him from the north through Chickasaw Bayou. And you have a battle here, actually, which is quite an ugly affair for Sherman, especially difficult terrain, all the rest of it. Yeah. And meanwhile, you have Grant, who Grant was originally here at Milliken's Bend here, and then he marches through here, goes through, he crosses around Bruinsburg, and you got places like Grand Gulf and Port Gibson, crosses through Armenia. And we have also a battle Champion Hill here, where Grant and Sherman were both joined up to besiege Vicksburg. By the time you get into, you get to late May, early June kind of time. But yeah, it takes Vicksburg a fair while. Now, as you can see, it's July 4th, 1863, that Vicksburg actually surrenders. Now, people made a mistake of thinking that Gettysburg was a decisive battle. Now, if you were to say that was a decisive battle of the Eastern Theatre, that was definitely the case. However, I do agree with what a lot of the military historians say, including, for example, vlogging through history about guy who say, look, this was actually the most decisive campaign of the entire war. So, for example, I would say in a way that one of the most decisive battles, one of the most decisive campaigns of the Confederate side in terms of it lasting as long as it did, was the Valley Campaign, which is the best campaign done by a Confederate general, in the same way the Vicksburg campaign was the best general waged by a Union general. And certainly, I'll do a stream one day about the Vicksburg campaign. After, of course, I do want eventually a bit of a Valley campaign, because they both deserved a good stream dedicated to them. So yeah, you have Vicksburg, which falls, and so the Union forces in this entire campaign they suffer something like 8,000 to 9,000 casualties. Meanwhile, the Confederates, especially under Pemberton, they suffer altogether around 56,000 casualties, of whom you have something like the vast majority are taken captive, especially the 32,000 who were caught up in Vicksburg. Now, yeah, you see Joseph E. Johnston here. Now, yeah, that's one thing where there was around the area of Jackson, Mississippi, the state capital, and it does fall around that time because Jefferson Davis he basically screws over the Confederates over here, where Joseph E. Johnston had a bit of ambiguity around which troops he was commanding, like how much authority he had in the area. And Pemberton, meanwhile, he was a favourite of Jefferson Davis. Although I will say, John C. Pemberton was very much of a guy who great at building fortifications. So, for example, if I can draw you, I can remember. Fort Pemberton around here along the Yallabusha River. So yeah, that's where Pemberton really has his sort of good MO, which is building fortresses and building up defensive works. However, actual field command is not his gig, but Jefferson Davis he ignores that and just puts the guy in charge anyway. And well, look how bad it goes, where an entire army, as well as like entire army gets bottled up and forced to surrender on July 4th on the same week that you have Gettysburg, and not just that, the Confederacy is now cut in half effectively. The Mississippi River is just fully taken over. Now the Union they did take over. I think it was in May 1862 that they took New Orleans, which at that time was the biggest city in the South. So yeah, it's fair to say that July 1863 was really the turning point of the Civil War, really, where you really get to a point where it's the tide has decisively turned against the Confederates. Whatever success they might have gained in the Eastern Theater, even in the event of a Union defeat at Gettysburg, yeah, because of at Gettysburg, yeah, Vicksburg being lost was more of a decisive factor in the South losing than Gettysburg. Although it's not to say like Gettysburg can be underestimated. So yeah. So yeah, you do have this entire like yeah, pretty much the vast majority of Mississippi is now up for grabs, pretty much because Jackson falls. You have Joseph E. Johnston. He doesn't have anywhere near enough troops to go up against Grant and Sherman. He just doesn't. And Jefferson Davis screwed him over, so he's not in a position to resist. And yeah, as you get from like July into September, this is where Grant and Sherman not only are eyeing up possible vectors for future campaigns, but also they're looking into consolidating the rest of the state of Mississippi. Because it's worth noting that so Tennessee, for example, Eastern Tennessee was an area which had strong Union sympathies. Likewise, there are some areas of Mississippi that did have Union sympathies, and Grant and Sherman were looking to get to those areas. For example, you have, if anyone's watched that film, Free State of Jones, yeah, Jones County had quite a few Union supporters, especially that Newton Knight fella, which that film has its issues. Like it's very much one of those films where it's all about, it's very much of a left-wing interpretation of history, I suppose you could say, in terms of how it looks at Reconstruction and the Confederate war effort and other things. That, yeah, it's very much of a film where it's not my usual cup of tea. Like I'll still watch it, but yeah, it's not my usual cup of tea when I think of a Civil War film to kind of watch. So yeah, in September 1863, you have a Battle of Chickamauga, which I did mention last week, not last week, 2 weeks ago, sorry, where Braxton Bragg defeats Rosecrans. Now, I've been reading Mac. I don't know if Alabaster uh, is watching this stream whenever he is. I don't know if he'll be watching after it. Um, yeah, recommended a book by Colonel H, which I'm halfway through. I'm like 160 pages in, so I've got just under 100 pages or so left to read. And that particular book goes on about how hated Braxton Bragg truly was. Like Bragg genuinely was just a horrible general. He would have men executed in front of everyone else. Like he would believe very much, like he was very much like a Luigi Cadorna of the American South. If people know who I'm talking about, guy who was sternly disciplinarian to a point where it wasn't even just like, at least Wellington was respected because he was actually victorious and did actually care for the lives of his men, even though he was also a stern disciplinarian. In Bragg, he got the worst of all worlds. With Bragg, it's a matter of like he didn't feed his troops all that well. He was very harsh on them. He would have no problem he'd have no problem just berating officers in front of their men, which is one of the most cardinal rules of sort of military leadership. You don't do is you do not chastise officers in front of their men. But Albert Sidney Johnston knew this, for example, at Battle of Shiloh, where he was castigating this one guy for losing. But once he saw that the guy's feelings had been hurt, this is where Johnston, he takes a bit of plundering and says, "Oh, I shall take this as my spoils." Bragg, for example, he's not good at interpersonal skills, and there's a famous anecdote where, I'll say famous, relatively speaking, but yeah, don't know what happened there. You have Braxton Bragg who wins the Battle of Chickamauga, which, as in how bad a general do you have to be to lose to Braxton Bragg of all people? He another problem with him was also he was very unimaginative, where he only ever did frontal attacks, and it's only really the Battle of Chickamauga where he did actually have a plan in order to deal with the Union Army, because one thing Rosecrans does, which is a mistake, but it was a mistake saved by the fact that Braxton Bragg was so incompetent, was that Rosecrans actually split up his army in several chunks, and they were able to bunch up because Bragg and his subordinates missed opportunities, which is part of the course, I suppose. And yeah, you do have Braxton Bragg. He finally fights Chickamauga, very much a bloodbath on both sides. And the only reason the battle was even won was because Rosecrans thought he had a gap in his line, because some of his men under a guy called Brennan were actually hiding underneath some brush. They were using really good conceal. However, Rosecrans and his staff, they erroneously thought there was a gap in their line, so they took men from their right flank to reinforce their left. But in so doing, they actually created a real gap just as Longstreet comes in, and Longstreet opens up this gap with an assault, and well, the battle's lost. It's very much a matter of, and Rosecrans wasn't exactly a terrible general. He'd be decent, like if he was playing like a macro real-time strategy game today, like if he was playing a total war game, he'd be a fairly decent player at that. But it was just But it's worth noting as well. At an earlier battle called Stones River, up in Tennessee, up near Murfreesboro in Middle Tennessee, Rosecrans actually saw one of his friends get his head taken off with a cannonball. So there were some people that say that just as Joseph Hooker lost faith in himself and suffered concussion at Chancellorsville, Rosecrans suffered something similar at Chickamauga. And yeah, so you have this Battle of Chickamauga, which goes really badly, and Braxton Bragg wins it. However, the success does not last long because Grant and Sherman they later hear word of this and may get their army towards the Chattanooga area, which at this time Chattanooga was besieged by Bragg. Now, Rosecrans was trapped in here. You also have Ambrose Burnside, who was up in Knoxville in eastern Tennessee. He later gets besieged by Longstreet, who, by the time of the Battle of Chattanooga, sorry, Longstreet is detached to try and pin down Burnside. Meanwhile, Grant and Sherman, they come upon Chattanooga at this very opportune time. They reinforce the defense, and then this is where you get Grant and George H. Thomas. You also have, for example, Sherman, as you can see, on November 24th. He comes across here upon the Chickamauga Creek, and yet he commands his troops on the 25th. Now, one thing worth noting was Sherman was meant to originally take Billy Goat Hill, was originally meant to take Tunnel Hill, but he actually ends up taking Billy Goat Hill. It was a bit of a misunderstanding on his part, but nevertheless, his objective of getting Bragg to weaken his centre did actually work. And indeed, this becomes a case where you have on the 25th, where Sherman is attacking frantically against Claiborne, especially on the right flank. Hardee is dealing with Sherman's attacking. And the thing about this ground is it's really rugged ground because this is Missionary Ridge. Around Tunnel Hill is named so because you've got this gorge around here, which one thing about this gorge is it's a very good place to conceal an army, very good to screen your army movements. In a similar way to how Stonewall Jackson used the Shenandoah Valley to screen some of his army movements in the Valley campaign. Similar thing happened here with Claiborne and his troops on the right flank. And Claiborne, actually, he does defend really well. And at some point, as mentioned last week, I'm going to do a stream at some point about Patrick R. Claiborne. I don't know when, but I will do a stream about him because it's very... I think it's because of Shelby Foote, especially in Ken Burns' documentary, where the last 30, 40 years I've seen Claiborne really score a high reputation among Civil War historians. So you have the fighting around it. It's really a matter of very active assaults, and eventually they do break the Confederate line. It doesn't help as well that you have Hooker attack on the Union right, attacking the Confederate left. Now, Grant at first, he was planning, he only really meant for Hooker to attack to tease Bragg into weakening his center to reinforce his left. And the thing about the Confederate center was because they had these rifle pits, which they didn't really have much more than that. They weren't as well fortified as they could have been, but to be fair, they had the Missionary Ridge in their favor. Grant, at a later point, once he sees Sherman's attack is flagging in some areas, this is where he orders George H. Thomas. He was actually a guy from Virginia who served under the Union, because it's worth noting that see how Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson serve as Virginians under the Confederate Army, which is free and fair. It's honourable from their point of view because they're fighting with their state. But at the same time, you have someone like George H. Thomas, as well as earlier on in the war, a guy called Winfield Scott, who were both from Virginia, but they stuck to the Union. So again, it's kind of very much a fratricidal war, as obvious reason. And you see, for example, especially on the left flank, you see abandoned works because basically you have Hooker, Stevenson, for example, has to pull back. I mean, you have Stewart, and this is where on November 25th, you just get a general retreat because the pressure was just too much for the Confederates to deal with. And in the case of a battle of Chattanooga, I believe something like Sherman, despite the difficult ground against him and dealing with some really capable Confederate troops and so on, it's something like he suffers 2,000 casualties at the battle on November 25th. So as there's another map for the Battle of Missionary Ridge, where it's really just a matter of, despite the Confederates having good high ground working in their favor, they just couldn't hold. And after this, on November 26th, I believe, you do have a battle called Ringgold Gap, where Patrick R. Claiborne, with 4,000 men, he manages to defend against 16,000 troops under Hooker. And that's certainly probably one battle where we can look in hindsight and think, how was Patrick R. Claiborne not promoted for that? Well, the problem is in January 1864, Claiborne authors a document that says, okay, the Confederates ought to think about freeing the slaves in exchange for their military service, which would have been the best of all worlds from the Confederate point of view, because on one hand, you don't have to constantly worry about the slaves as much because, the Confederates, some people on their side are saying we ought to get rid of slavery anyway because we don't want to be like Sparta, where you're constantly having to watch a slave population and it's constant fear of anxiety and you're constantly having to fear slave rebellions in the midst of a war where all your men are drafted. And, and other practical dilemmas of that sort. And so, but Claiborne, he gets shot down, even to a point where guys like Joseph Wheeler actually said, if Claiborne was around me, Joseph Wheeler said he would have killed him. And it's, strong sentiment was stirred. And it's just really stupid stubbornness on the part of the Confederates that clung so much to slavery. And, I'm probably repeating myself, but it's fair to say, look, Patrick R. Claiborne, he gets screwed over. He gets passed over for promotion, even despite of, as I mentioned, like a rear guard action fight. So, and I suppose it would be here on the map. You got like Ringold's Gap is somewhere like northeast here. So if you want to get a good visualization of what Missionary Ridge would look like, this is what it looks like. Very much rugged ground, and you've got puddles here. You've got good sort of subtle rises around here so that troops can take cover from rifle fire. And it's good ground to defend. But you already had a situation where the army under Bragg was just depleted anyway from a disaster of Chickamauga. And it's worth noting as lest I forget that. So when Vicksburg surrendered, it's worth noting that while Grant was known as unconditional surrender Grant, the two biggest surrenders he organised were Vicksburg and Appomattox, which were not unconditional, and the troops who had surrendered were paroled. In other words, they were just told, you can go back to your farms, your houses, you can go back to your lives, just so long as you do not bear arms against us again. Now, those Confederate soldiers who served at Vicksburg, you got to factor they were deep in enemy territory, so Grant and Sherman were not thinking of transporting loads and loads of prisoners. They just paroled them to save having to deplete men from the main army. The problem was Braxton Bragg and Jefferson Davis, they actually had these men illegally and improperly put down as exchanged, in quotation marks, and in so doing, put these men into army formations in the army of Tennessee in time for Chickamauga, which this is one thing that Sherman mentioned in his memoirs as being a matter of he doesn't look upon the Confederates as a belligerent who are willing to play fair, and that's why he's not determined to play fair with them either. And it, again, it's the one thing where it's a valid complaint because you parole prisoners only for them to be fighting against you because they literally just forced it back into the fight. Not very much of a disharmonious kind of way, And as you can see here, this is like an artwork not long after the battle. And you see like trench lines, for example, dug around like zigzagging. And very much of a long battle, it's Now, in February 1864, you do have the Meridian Campaign, which I did mention in Nathan Bread of Forest and last week. So Sherman, for example, sets out from Vicksburg around here along the Mississippi River, where Mississippi borders with Louisiana, and he sets off easterly through Jackson, the state capital, through to Meridian, and his job is mainly to tear up supply lines. And he wants to see if he can take away like almost like an entire like 20,000 men, so like an entire army corps almost, uh, away from the main Confederate army down south at this time of so that way he can help to take the pressure off someone like Grant further up north. It doesn't work because, as mentioned last week, like William Soy Smith, who sets it from Memphis, and he goes down here, he's defeated at Okolona. So you have the battles of West Point and Okolona, which go really badly for the Union forces, and this is where Sherman had to turn back towards Vicksburg because he knows he's now vulnerable to raids to his rear, tearing up his supplies, and he can't have that. So, yeah, he chooses to go back to Vicksburg. So this is why the Meridian campaign was a mixed kind of scenario where it's kind of like, well, he could say it's a victory from Sherman's point of view because he did what he set himself out to do, to just tearing up supply lines. He got to Meridian. However, it's also a failure because William Soy Smith, like the cavalry guy, did not fulfill his end of a bargain. Like he failed, where Forrest, his adversary, succeeded, and so yeah, this is what happens. Yeah, so yeah, this happens first February, and as you get into early March, 3rd of March, yeah, Sherman gets back to Vicksburg, and meanwhile, yeah, you got Smith who goes back to Memphis by the time of late February, 4 days after Okolona. So yeah, you do have the Meridian campaign, which, as you can see from the maps, there's not really a great deal to be said about it, other than to say, yeah, look, it was just never better Forrest just been too brilliant against someone like William Soy Smith, and William Soy Smith actually suffers a censure for the rest of the war from Sherman. A censure is censure. It's essentially one of the things where it's essentially like a black mark on a guy's reputation. So Smith, he has to suffer with that for the rest of the war, and yeah, so Sherman. Not long after this, into March 1864, you do have George B. McClellan. So the commanding generals of the U.S. Army in the Civil War were, at first, it was Winfield Scott up until November or December 1861, where George B. McClellan takes over. By the time you get to July 1862, you get Henry Halleck replacing him because at that point Lincoln lost patience with McClellan in terms of as a commanding general in that particular faculty. So he replaces it with Henry Halleck. Now, Henry Halleck, I wouldn't say no to doing a stream about him, but I don't know how that would exactly go because I don't think it would be like a full 2 hour stream, or it wouldn't be the most well detailed stream because the thing about Halleck, simply put, is he's more of a chief of staff guy. You think of like Louis Alexandre Berthier for Napoleon. That's what Henry Halleck is for the Union Army. So Halleck, he was organized in Western Theater armies at the start of the war, and he's fairly middle. He's not great, but not terrible either. Like he did fairly good in terms of organizational aspects, but at the same time, he's a by the book kind of guy, and yeah, it's very much a matter of Henry Halleck. He gets put again in commanding general of the U.S. Army, which wasn't his gig, and he then gets, when Ulysses S. Grant gets promoted in March 1864 to that position, Halleck is moved over to chief of staff, and yeah, he did fairly well for it, and that's where he stays for the rest of the war, and he does fairly well. I said, Henry Halleck is very much like the Louis Alexandre Berthier of the Union Army, in much the same way that you can, for example, regard Ulysses S. Grant as being the sort of I would say. I mean, some people. I wouldn't say Napoleon, but certainly like I'm trying to think which Marshall would probably best like because I probably would say someone like kind of like a mix of you got Napoleon, Suchet, and Davout in the form of Ulysses S. Grant. Like he embodies like the best aspects. The only reason I hesitate to say a bit of Suchet in comparison to Grant was because Grant didn't really like he wasn't really known for his skills with administering territory in the same way that Suchet was in Aljon in northern Spain, but nevertheless, yeah, I mean, I think like the most famous incident of Grant ruling over a region was, of course, his general orders, or specific orders number 11, where he took the Jews from his particular department of the Mississippi, which includes both Tennessee. And yeah, it's a very much of a what people say is a controversial episode in Grant's life, in terms of him chucking up the Jews in that particular sector. So yeah, you have this is Sherman up to this point where in March 1864 he's promoted to be in charge of all Western Theater armies. So west of the Appalachian Mountains up until Trans-Mississippi Theater, Sherman is in there in charge. Now, I didn't have any illusions that the stream wasn't going to last as long as other streams have done, mainly because Sherman, in terms of controversy, really manifests from the latter end of 1864 into 1865. There was March to the Sea, and really, and that's of course, yeah, independent command and so on. So yeah, there's not really, I haven't seen any questions in the chat, so I'll probably end the stream very shortly. I will say, so I don't know if I'm going to put in sources for this, because the only source I've been really using for this has been his personal memoirs, which I would personally recommend reading. I've got the for reference, I've got the complete annotated version edited by John F. Marsalek and Louis P. Gallo and David S. Nolan, who very much like Civil War scholars in their own right. And they also did an annotated version of Ulysses S. Grant's memoirs from 8 years ago or 7 years ago, something like that. I haven't got that. I've only got the personal memoirs by Penguin Classics, which we'll do because I know a lot more about Grant than I do about Sherman, hence the need for annotated edition of that. So, yeah, that's the only thing. I don't think I'm going to put sources in for this. I will put them in though for next week, because that's really where I'm going to be drawing upon multiple sources to ascertain a good conclusion to what I think about William T. Sherman and the controversy that surrounds him. Because, as I mentioned at the start of Sherman, I don't think Sherman did anything wrong in context of the Civil War. I just think he did what he had to. He did not glorify in it. And again, this is why I have not put a piece of music in for this, because all of the Union songs I could see were all triumphalist in nature, which is part of course. I mean, I don't blame him. There's nothing wrong with that. It's just, it feels wrong to do that for William T. Sherman stream, because Sherman was very much of a soldier in his own right, in the sense that he did not glorify war. He said, look, I'm fighting against armed rebels, and I'm arguing for the swiftest end to the war, which involves him doing some very controversial means in going through Georgia and burning tons all over the countryside to effect the end to that Civil War. So again, this is where I'm looking at William T. Sherman, and I think, it will be developed in full. And for example, I've got other books, such as a book I used when studying Stonewall Jackson, because it's worth noting that Stonewall Jackson and William T. Sherman, as mentioned earlier, will have one mind about total war. It just so happens that Sherman eventually got his way, while Stonewall Jackson died before he could get his way. And so without further ado, I'll show them stream now. I said I should be doing. It should be next Thursday. Next Thursday on the 16th, unless something changes, in which case I will notify through YouTube post. But in the meantime, it should be on the 16th. As for Ulysses S. Grant Part 1, I'll be doing that on the 24th, because 23rd is St. George's Day, and it doesn't feel right to do Ulysses S. Grant and the American Civil War on St. George's Day. So, 2 weeks' time will be. 2 weeks' time will be Ulysses S. Grant Part 1. And without further ado, I'll end the stream here. Farewell all. I hope my constant smacking up, like, because my lips are really dry just by drinking loads of water. So I apologize for the noise from my lips or my coughing from earlier when uh, I swallowed my water the wrong way and so on. Yeah, so apologies in much respect for that. And without further ado, I'll end the stream here.